Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. The second coming is most commonly referred to as the return of Jesus, but what if it actually included Hercules, Leviathan, the Antichrist, the gods of antiquity, and the ensuing battle prophesied in the Bible? Our good friend Derek Gilbert addresses all this and so much more in his latest biblically sound expose, Last Clash of the Titans. Derek hosts Skywatch TV, a Christian television program that airs on several national networks, the long-running interview podcast, A View from the Bunker, and co-hosts Sci Friday, a weekly television program that analyzes science news with his wife, author, and analyst Sharon Gilbert. Derek's a Christian, husband and father, co-author with Josh Peck of The Day the Earth Stands Still, Unmasking the Old Gods Behind UFOs, ETs, and the Official Disclosure Movement, and the author of The Great Inception, Satan's Psyops from Eden to Armageddon. He's also authored the novels The God Conspiracy and Iron Dragons, and he's a contributing author to the anthologies God's Ghostbusters, Blood on the Altar, I Predict What 12 Global Experts Believe You'll See by 2025, and When Once We Were a Nation. He's a featured guest here on Revealing the Truth and appears on the second Monday of every month for what we call the Derek Gilbert Hour. Joining us right now to talk about the days we're living in and what's happening around the globe in the prophetic, not the pathetic, is our good friend Derek Gilbert. Welcome.
Well, Rabbi Eric, it's an honor to be here as always. Enjoy being here, especially in these times that things are really interesting out there.
Things are happening. I think that the release of by your part of your company, Skywatch TV, Defender Publishing, of the new book by Carl Gallups and Zev Porat, The Rabbi, The Secret Message and the Identity of Messiah, is exactly spot on timing-wise with this rumbling, grumbling, groaning of the earth that people are starting to talk about. Rabbis are starting to talk about predicting Messiah's arrival. And it is something that they're saying is coming. There's a two Messiah theory. There are so many different theories out there. And this is an area you've done a great deal of research in. I'd love to hear your opinion of these views. I do a program called Revealing Prophecy, and I go out and capture various points of views of different contributors, not always ones that I agree with, but I don't think that that's what you and I were put here to do, is only present things we agree with. We need to make people aware of, I don't agree with Marcion, I don't agree with Andy Stanley, but I certainly want to talk about what it is they're promoting in order to open the eyes of believers to what's out there. I don't believe in Freemasonry, I don't believe in Catholicism, but they still have to be aware and equipped to be able to confront biblically with sound response. So we always talk about the end times. To me, it's always been a misnomer because it's not the end of time. It's not really the end times. It's really the beginning times. It's the beginning of the reign of Messiah and then the events that follow after this great war. So what's going on? Because there's now Haredi rabbis, Kabbalistic rabbis. I even have a rabbi, Reform rabbi of the largest Reform congregation in Cincinnati, coming on the show for a second time. And he's going to talk about what Christians need to understand about Jesus in regards to Judaism. And so this is breakthrough stuff when you have, even in the mainstream Jewish line of thinking, a recognition of what Christians need to understand about the Jewishness of Jesus. And this was, you might remember this, in Time Magazine's forecast for what would be coming in the new millennium, in the Y2K version of Time Magazine. One of the top 10 predictions was that there would be a return to a restoration of the Jewishness of Jesus would be one of the things that they were predicting to happen in the new millennium. So here we are looking at the Jewishness of Jesus and the return of Messiah. What's your take on all this?
It's really intriguing, and I'm certainly not an expert. This is really more Rabbi Zev Porat's area because he's more personally familiar with the Sanhedrin in Israel. For me, as a Gentile, someone who's been grafted into that olive tree, I was under the impression that the Sanhedrin had not existed since the Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70 A.D. But as Zev has told you, I'm sure, there's always been this rabbinic court sort of behind the scenes that really controls the religious life of Israel. The Orthodox and the Haredi rabbis who are operating kind of behind the scenes, and they are becoming more and more vocal here in recent days, in recent years. I've been watching this since coming to Skywatch TV about 4 years ago and noting the frequency, how often these Orthodox and Haredi, and I understand for many of us we would use the term ultra-Orthodox, but that's considered a derogatory term, I think, by the Haredi Jews. So the Orthodox and Haredi rabbis are more and more frequently, more and more often, making statements, declarations, even predictions about the arrival of Messiah. Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, who is considered one of the leading Haredi rabbis, only just a few years ago began making predictions about the imminent arrival of Messiah. Now, of course, as Christians, we understand he's coming back. He's already been here once, and he's coming back. Our Jewish brothers and sisters are looking for the first arrival because they were looking for a different type of Messiah than they got when Jesus was walking among them. But he has been making some very clear predictions, and they're looking at things happening in their neighborhood. The Syrian civil war has been pointed to a number of times by prominent rabbis as the war of Gog and Magog. Now, as Christians, we should understand that in the Jewish mind, that's very significant because that, to them, is the war to end all wars. But as Christians, we should also understand that Gog and Magog, if you read Ezekiel 38 and 39 carefully, is the war to end all wars. Ezekiel 39 concludes with a rather gruesome sacrificial feast on the battlefield of the slain, where God offers up the slain army of Magog as a feast for the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. That tracks almost identically with Revelation 19, which is the aftermath of Armageddon. So the Gog-Magog war is Armageddon. So we need to, as Christians, to understand what the Jewish religious experts, their teachers, are passing along to our Jewish brothers and sisters, which is that we are in the last days before Messiah arrives. As Christians, as a Christian, I agree with that. It's just we're looking for a different Messiah. And so maybe this should focus, and again, Zev Porat would speak to this better than me, how we try to share the hope that we have in Jesus Christ with our brothers and sisters, because the time is growing short. Just last week, Rabbi Kanievsky, who is an elderly man and has been teaching for a very long time, again, considered one of the foremost authorities in Haredi Judaism, said that Messiah would arrive by the time of the Israeli election. The elections in Israel, because of the split within the ruling coalition that was headed up by, or that is headed up by Benjamin Netanyahu, the elections had been scheduled for November, but been moved up to April 9th. And Rabbi Kanievsky is saying, yeah, it's going to happen by the time of the election. Messiah is here, and he will reveal himself by April 9th. Now, another rabbi, Rabbi Meditayu Glazerson, who I have interviewed on Skywatch TV, is considered an expert in the Torah codes. These are not the same as the Bible codes. He only looks at the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, in the Hebrew letter sequences there to find messages perhaps that have been encoded by Yahweh into the Holy Scriptures. And he notes that in the book of Leviticus, I believe Leviticus 23, that there is some wording in there in the Hebrew, letter sequences that point to Messiah and Purim. And Purim this year, if I'm not mistaken, Rabbi Walker, is about 3 weeks before the election, so yes, sometime in March. So this is really remarkable that you've got scholars who take the Torah seriously, Jewish scholars who take the Torah very seriously, take the teachings of the elders very seriously, calling for the imminent arrival of Messiah. Again, I think the question for us as Christians is, how do we process this? We only give credence to prophecies that are in the Bible, and we know that according to Jesus, when he returns, he will be coming in the clouds with great glory. We won't miss it. He's not here already. We would have seen him in the clouds with great glory. So In that regard, we respectfully disagree with the rabbis in Israel, but we can agree that the time is growing short, which means we should have a sense of urgency about sharing the hope we have in Jesus with gentleness and respect.
Well, you make a very interesting point. I want to back up to one of your points. There was a prophecy. It was actually a maxim of Henry Kissinger, but I put it in the form of a prophetic, who made the statement, the Arabs can't make war without Egypt, and they can't make peace without Syria. This is credited to Henry Kissinger when he was Secretary of State. It's very interesting that here we are now, many years past his time as Secretary of State, that we're looking at Syria as being a melting pot of the almost untoppable Assad regime. That he is so entrenched, he is so implanted that any belief that he is going to be taken out is a false belief, because he's got support from Iran now. He's got support from the former Soviet Union. He's got support from all over the Middle East, and it is this unusual combination of European supported, Turkey being European, supported regime, which is counterintuitive. We look at him like Castro, like we would overthrow the Castro regime, we would overthrow the Assad regime, but it is the same thing as the Castro is not going to be overthrown. It is completely entrenched, and it is an important pivotal play in this alliance that has to form in this alliance of Gog-Magog. I don't know that there's going to be a Lebanon. Some of the scholars are now looking at it and saying that in this next coming war that Israel will become sovereign in an additional part of the Genesis 15 land, that should there be a Hezbollah, should there be a fourth Lebanon war, that Israel will just take over Lebanon and just annex it into Israel, giving them much more strategic locations along the Golan Heights against Syria, against the disputed area. You've got the lower area, Mount Bental area, but now you have the Mount Hermon area. And if Lebanon became annexed into Israel, as some might think, in this, what you would quote as sovereign Israel. And that's a very important term, because in my mind, sovereign Israel is Genesis 15 boundaries. That until Israel occupies the Abrahamic covenant, the land covenant, the second part of the Abrahamic covenant, which is the land covenant, which the Gentiles are grafted into, that land covenant, that includes all of Lebanon, all of Syria, most of Iraq, up to Mosul, just close to Baghdad, not including Baghdad, then all of Jordan, northern Saudi Arabia, and northern Egypt becomes that parallelogram, if you will, that is what I would consider to be, anytime you refer to sovereign Israel, would be that geography. Well, that geography, when you look at it, and you look at the players of what many think was the precursor, the Ezekiel 38 reference to a land recovering from war, is one of the predictors of Israel's, of this upcoming campaign of Armageddon, that it occurs in a land recovering from war. Many scholars had been predicting, and rightfully so, Psalm 83, that Psalm 83 Confederacy. I think maybe you and I once looked at a map together and said, could it have been that the Six-Day War, where we saw all 10 of those Confederates together, all played a part in it? Could that have already occurred? And that's we don't know, but the 10 players were. But when we look at this alliance in Ezekiel 38, none of the Psalm 83 Confederates are named in the Ezekiel 38 Confederacy, so they must be either out of play or play not a leading role in this, but the nations that are so visible today are the nations that are so prevalent in the Ezekiel 38-39 prophecy. And as we look at it from a Middle Eastern perspective, looking this way, as opposed to us looking at the Middle East, in the Middle East, they're dealing with a rising Iran that now has a missile that has an 861-mile range. That's Tehran to Tel Aviv. That's very important, that at 861-mile name, 860-mile attribute to this mid-range missile is that distance. And so this is now becoming a much more lively threat to us. Our talking about the return of Messiah is that I think all parties, Jew and Gentile, non-believing Jew, believing Gentile, and Israeli, believe that when the Messiah comes, he's coming to do war. He's coming back as Ben David, as son of David, and that it is going to be at a time of war. And so when we look at this picture of coming on a horse, biblically, a king rides a horse into battle. This is why Jesus rode a donkey. It was a sign of peace. Many miss this nuance because they don't know about the history of kings and horses and how that happens and why that happens.
Right, a sign of kingship, actually. Riding the donkey was a sign of royalty. The soldiers would ride the horse, as you correctly indicate, but even more than peace, it was a sign that Jesus was entering Jerusalem as a king.
Absolutely, absolutely. And recognized, son of David. They called him son of David.
Right.
When he was really coming as Ben Yosef, as son of Joseph, son of suffering, if you would. So we have this discussion where it's becoming very lively discussion within the Jewish sector. Now there is a sector of Judaism which is the Lubavitchers, which are the believers in Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who died in the 80s in Brooklyn, who many considered to be the Messiah. I've actually heard it alluded to, maybe jokingly, maybe not, that they know that the Messiah must supernaturally appear in Jerusalem, not by train, not by plane, not by boat, but supernaturally appear. So some have said, well, he's tunneling under the ocean and he will make his entrance there. And I've heard it said by those who are true, really sold out for Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitch Rabbi, but that just doesn't seem plausible to you or to I. But you and I talk about the plausible and the implausible, so we should introduce that. The average church-going Christian, when they look at the non-believing Jew, don't understand why they don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. I think it's important for us to look at this dual Messiah belief, that we look at this understanding, and the charge that we were given as believers. Now, as a Jewish believer, I join that same charge, is to, in these days while we wait, is to preach the gospel and reach the four corners of the earth, as Skywatch TV does, as the Igniting Nation Broadcasting Network does. You know, I think we are one of the few networks that have a completely cooperative relationship and look to partner in every way we can, because why wouldn't we? We're not, I mean, we have to keep the doors open from a finances perspective, but we're not financially competing. We are gospel partners in advancing the kingdom, and we bring different perspectives and different points of view. And you, of course, do such incredible research. Well, what is the prevalent thought as to why Jesus was not the Messiah?
Well, I think it's the same reason Christians who lock themselves into a specific theory or system of understanding end times prophecy find it difficult to accept that maybe events on the ground don't fit into their prophetic system. There's a joke among that on the day that the rapture takes place, whether it's mid, pre-wrath, post, whatever, that there will be some group of Christians who are saved by the blood of Jesus Christ, as we're rising up in the air, who'll be arguing that, no, you're not supposed to be here yet. This can't be, that kind of thing. And I think, tongue in cheek, that there's an element of that took place, sadly, 2,000 years ago, that the rabbis, the teachers of Jewish religious thought 2,000 years ago had taught and come to believe that when Messiah returns, he will return as a conqueror. They could not accept the suffering servant described in Zechariah 12, beginning at verse 10. And I will pour out in the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. They could not see that as the Messiah. They could not see the Messiah of Psalm 22, which was the description of the Messiah on the cross, broken, his bones out of joint, people gambling, casting lots for his clothing, surrounded by the bulls of Bashan, which, by the way, is not a reference to cattle. It's talking about the divine, not the bovine. They could not accept a Messiah who would suffer, who would die. And so they created this idea of a second Messiah, Messiah ben Joseph, or Mashiach ben Yosef, who would die, and then a conquering Messiah, Messiah ben David, who would come along and either resurrect Messiah ben Joseph or be the resurrected Messiah ben Joseph. It's not clear. I mean, there are different schools of thought on this. And this Messiah ben David would be the supernatural conqueror who defeats the army of Gog of Magog. And during the Middle Ages, there was this other character called Arminus who was developed during the exegesis by the rabbis, who plays some role in this. But Gog of Magog would be defeated by Messiah ben David, who then would cleanse the holy city Jerusalem, by which it means all non-Jews would be removed. And then the nations of the world, the 70 nations, which just means all of the other nations, would be judged along with their guardian angels. So there is a belief among Judaism that these other entities that we would call the gods of the pagan world, that they exist, but that they and the nations will then be sent to, eternal punishment. This is, sadly, I think, going to lead our Jewish brothers and sisters into a similar deception and lead them astray, just as they were led astray during the first coming of Jesus. They were looking for a different Messiah, and once again here they'll be looking for a geopolitical conqueror. And I know we're getting toward the end of the hour here, so I don't want to open a can of worms that we can't unpack before
well, what I want to do is actually want to lead in with that, because there's a move underfoot to build the third temple. Now, you and I both read in Daniel that there's going to be a place, one to come to bring the abomination of desolation.
Right.
Why would those who know that same scripture that I know and you know want to build a building, a third temple, that they would know is being referenced as being defiled? Now, there's many comments and commentaries that say, well, there's nothing that says the third temple would be built, that your body is the temple of the Lord, the reference to naot or naos in the Greek, and therefore it doesn't have to be a physical temple. But at the end of the halfway mark of the last week of the 70, or the last year, the 70th year, the last 3.5 years, it says that they will bring an end to Jewish worship. And as a Jew, I can tell you that in every Jew's mind, Jewish worship always means the temple. It doesn't mean Shabbat dinner at my home. It doesn't mean going to even my local synagogue for the Moedim, the feast days. It means the temple in Jerusalem is what's defined as the restoration of Jewish worship. In order to bring an end to that, there must be this place. And I believe it is the tribulation temple, and that Isaiah even refers to a temple that God will not sanction. And when we come back from break, I want to talk to you about the move underfoot for the third temple, the prevailing deception that is going to deceive the elect, that is going to take the Christians that are the goat Christians and have them take the mark, and the Jews who are going to be key players in falling for this accord made with many that is going to allow them then to have this victory of having the third temple, which we all know what's going to happen to it, and even they know what's going to happen to it, but they feel like they can somehow, God will intervene and not allow it to happen. And we'll talk about some of this which is biblical, some of it which is mythological, some of it which is just pure and plain and simple hopeful. When we come back from this break, we'll be right back. Not everything that makes the headlines has biblical importance, but many events that happen around the world do, and you never hear about them. Igniting a Nation is pleased to teach Revealing Prophecy every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at the Marriott 280 in Birmingham. We will cover worldwide events and insider information that will connect the dots of what's happening around the world with biblical prophecy. If you happen to miss a class, we'll televise each week's class at 10 o'clock Central Time on ignitinganation.com and all our social media outlets. Copies of the teachings will also be available to purchase on our website at www.ignitinganation.com. The Lord meets you right where you are, and so does Igniting a Nation's new live streaming outlets. You can now watch Revealing the Truth, Revealing the Bible, and Prophecy Revealed simulcast live each Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 1 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time on YouTube Live, Facebook Live, Vimeo, Periscope, and through our website, www.ignitinganation.com. No matter what device you are using, our program will automatically scale so you won't have to miss a single program. And if you happen to miss an episode, you can always subscribe to the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel and access over 1,000 interviews and never miss your favorite authors, special guests, and topics that interest you the most.
There are lots of ways to see Israel, but nothing compares to seeing the land of the book and the people of the book through the eyes of two Jewish believers who can take you on a journey that will bring the entire Bible to life. When you join Rabbi Eric Walker and his #1 rated tour guide, Edo Canaan, in Israel, you'll experience incredible teachings, first-class accommodations, and actually walk where Jesus walked. You will experience the Bible transforming from black and white into living color, and you will never see the Bible in the same way again. For more information, visit us at www.ignitinganation.com/events.
The Lord contends with what contends with you, and Igniting a Nation is committed to bringing to light each and every issue that faces a believer's life. Our live stream programming and teachings take you on a journey to finding biblical truth from a wide variety of experts who share their insights into a deeper walk with the Lord. We have assembled the most comprehensive panel of experts in the fields of prophecy, caregiving, healing from trauma, shame, and abuse, and so much more. We continue to expand our teachings and programming to meet your needs. We're committed to healing the nations with biblical truth. Visit www.ignitinganation.com to develop a deeper walk with the Lord and start your journey to a transformed life. The Bible commands us to study to show ourselves approved, but most study using Bible study tools and not actually studying the Bible chapter and verse. Igniting a Nation is pleased to present Revealing the Bible, recorded and taught each week before a live audience. We take you deeper into the actual Bible and verse in both Hebrew and English, and connect the dots between the Old and New Testament. You can attend our 2 classes in Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, or watch the program every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time on ignitinganation.com and all our other simulcast outlets. For more information, visit www.ignitinganation.com/events. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Derek Gilbert, Skywatch TV, author of The Last Clash of the Titans, and just put final pen to a new book that'll be releasing later this year. Can't wait to read it, can't wait to get it, can't wait to cover it on this program. I know it's going to be exciting. Derek, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
When we left, we were getting kind of worked up, kind of getting a fever pitch building about this third temple, this tribulation temple, this place talking about Jewish worship, and the end of Jewish worship comes at the halfway point in this what I would consider to be the third temple, the tribulation temple, where it brings the end, and it's very specific in its description that Jewish worship ends. When we read about Jewish worship, we always put it in the context of temple worship, the Moedim, the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 required feast days of Passover, of Shavuot or Pentecost, and then in the fall, the Feast of Tabernacles, which, by the way, is so striking to me in this new rhetoric about removing the Old Testament from the church, is that when you remove Zechariah 14 from that whole dialogue and the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles required by the Gentile nations, when Messiah reigns, you remove a whole section of God's covenant promise of blessing and curses, which is the Genesis 12:3 Abrahamic covenant that says that all the nations, the Gentiles, everybody, will have to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem each year, beginning with the Feast of Tabernacles, or God will withhold rain in its season, which is the ultimate threat of drought, famine, pestilence, death, and destruction. And whether or not you're talking about rain being symbolic of the Holy Spirit, or you're talking about physical rain in the terms of your people being able to drink and your crops being watered, regardless of whether or not you are literal or you are symbolic, God withholding his rain is a very serious threat.
Well, and the thing that intrigues me about that section of Zechariah 14, it begins at verse 16 through verse 19, is that the Feast of Tabernacles required the slaughter of 70 bulls. When you read the instructions in the book of Leviticus, it is very specific. On day 1 of the festival, you slaughter 13 bulls. On day 2, it's 12. Day 3, 11. Day 4, and so on, until you reach 70. But there are other pagan rituals from the ancient world about the time of Moses and going back to the time of Abraham that required the slaughter of 70 animals, 70 sheep in the case of one in particular, at the ancient city of Emar, which is in northern Syria near Aleppo. For Dagon, who was the chief god of that part of Syria, later became the chief god of the Philistines, but there were 70 animals, sheep, slaughtered for Dagon and the gods of the city, the 70 gods of the city. There's also a tradition among the pagan Canaanites that their creator god, El, who was just Dagon by a different name, lived on Mount Hermon with his 70 sons. In Jewish tradition, the 70 gods of the nations. When God divided the nations after the Tower of Babel, according to Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, God divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God, the number of the B'nai Ha-Elohim. This is a representation of all the other gods, the pagan gods, which were allotted to the nations after the Tower of Babel, the host of heaven, the sun, the moon, the stars. God warned the Israelites not to chase after the host of heaven. Moses, he said, don't bow down and worship the sun, the moon, and the host of heaven. All these things have been allotted to the other nations, but Israel was God's allotted heritage, Yahweh's allotted heritage. So the sacrifice at Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths, was all about God reminding Israel that these bulls representing the gods of the other nations would be sacrificed. They would be ended. God delivering Israel, delivering his people from the gods of the other nations. So again, it's interesting that in the after Messiah's return, that this will be honored as a commemoration that God has delivered us from the gods, the pagan gods, the small g gods, the fallen angels, if you will, who were placed over the other nations and rebelled against God's authority. Again, this spiritual war, this supernatural war is more real than we have been taught in our churches. And at least in this respect, the word is very clear here in the Old Testament, and our Jewish brothers and sisters are aware of it. They've continued to keep these festivals throughout the years, even though we understand that we now have a direct line to the throne room of God because our high priest is sitting at the right hand of the Father. And by the way, he's of the tribe of Judah, so the law has been changed. But still, there is this prophecy that tells us and reminds us what this war is all about. God delivering us from the hand of these fallen who have rebelled against his authority and want to take us to the lake of fire with them.
You know, it's so significant, and you're a great watcher of patterns, as am I. The number 70 being so significant in the Bible. There were 70 grandsons of Noah, the 70 nations, of course, that we talk about in the campaign of Armageddon. There was Joseph and the 70. The Sanhedrin is the high priest and the 70. There was
the 70 elders of Israel who were called up Mount Sinai with Aaron and Moses to behold God face to face. They saw the God of Israel, and he did not lay a hand on them. They beheld God, and they ate and drank. This was a message to the spirit realm, to the gods of the nations, that the divine council would be reconstituted with humanity someday, and that we would return to our place and, in fact, take their places in the divine council.
You know, and then you have Jesus sending the 70 out, 2 by 2. So 70 is a very, very important number, and the sacrifice of the 70 animals during the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, you know, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the sacrificial system. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what takes place in the millennial reign. I think the last 7 chapters of Ezekiel make it pretty clear and help us understand that there was never salvation under the law. None of it. There's nothing in the writings of Moses that indicates salvation. God gives a reference to salvation to Abraham because of his obedience, and we know the patriarch's place in the kingdom of heaven because we're told in the New Testament, you pray to the God of the living, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the living, not the God of the dead. So we know where the patriarchs are. But what's interesting is that our perception that Jesus was the elimination of sacrifice. Period. Jesus was the Levitical sacrifice for sin, but yet we still see that during the Feast of Tabernacles, during the all the festivals, the Sabbath offering, the fellowship offering, the peace offering, when you look at the last 7 chapters of Ezekiel, which tells us, you know, it's interesting that the general Christian will say, but the book of Revelation tells us about the millennial reign and there's no details. Well, that's because the details have already been given to us in the last 7 chapters of Ezekiel, where it tells us about the reinstitution of the sacrificial system, and it's confirmed in Zechariah, because when you go to the Feast of Tabernacles, you do not go to the temple empty-handed. This is a kind of the rule among all rules, is that you just don't go. You don't go to the king empty-handed. There's never a reference biblically, mythologically, historically. You've never walked in the presence of the king empty-handed. You bring a gift to the king. The Magi did not come to see the Messiah empty-handed. They brought a gift to the king. This is all very much historically confirmed biblically confirmed, mythologically confirmed, and therefore when you're going to this Feast of Tabernacles, and the beauty of all this is that it's interesting that in Isaiah it talks about that those born, because there will be birth during the 1,000-year reign, people will be born, that they will be given 100 years to come to faith in Messiah before they see death. Now, there will be no death of believers, because to be absent from the body is to be present from the Lord. Well, if I'm present with the Lord, where am I going to go? So to the believers, there is no death. But now imagine you look at Zechariah 14, beginning in verse 16, all right, and all the nations have to come to Jerusalem, meaning at least, and this is an 8-day feast, so at least 8 times, 8 days, 100 times, you've got to come. That's 800 days in the presence of the king, not to mention the other Shalosh Regalim, which Passover is going to be celebrated again, Pentecost will be celebrated again. You have all this. Listen, I had one encounter with the Messiah and I said yes. These folks get 800 encounters. Can you imagine how many times you stand before the king and you say, nope, he's not the Messiah. Nope, no. So 100 years God gives those born during the millennial reign the opportunity to accept Messiah. This is such fascinating stuff to you and I as we look at how this plays out in our belief system as to what's going to happen. Now, of course, some say you won't be there. Some say you might be there. Some say you could be there. Some say they're sure that we'll all find out at the same time, whether we're there or not. People ask me the question, am I one of the 144,000? Well, there was a requirement of one of the 144,000 that I don't meet. So my answer to them is no. Would I like to be one of the 144,000? Of course I would. But there's many more today than 144,000 Jewish believers. We're looking at the possibility based on the Jewish National Fund and the Jewish Agency predicting and saying that there's almost 1 million Jewish believers around the world, many of them still going to the regular synagogue, not making a public profession or disassociating themselves from their families and communities, but believing that Yeshua is the Messiah, which is what's going to happen in this groundswell of why we must continue down the path of the Great Commission, not the Great Omission. It's why you broadcast globally, we broadcast globally. It's to reach the lost sheep of the house of Israel and to all the nations, the uttermost corners of the earth. But the significance of Jews coming to faith brings us, each soul saved in the Jewish world brings us one step closer to that Matthew 23, 37 through 39 declaration that Jesus says, Jerusalem, you're not going to see me again until you cry out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So if there's no Jewish believers or there's no Jews calling for Jesus' return, he's not coming back, and that's a hard pill for many of the church to swallow, that, well, wait a second, we've been faithful for 2,000 years to the belief of Jesus, and our 1.5 billion voices aren't loud enough to say, come, Jesus, come. Well, not according to what Jesus said. And that doesn't diminish, because Paul made it very clear the calling on the Gentiles was to use their gift of salvation to provoke Israel to envy. Jesus was very clear in his preaching on the sheep and the goats that there are goat believers. How would you describe Esau? All right? Esau was hairy. Goats are hairy, so sheep are woolly. And so we start to take a look as we examine all this. Is there going to be a divide within the body? We already see a divide in the body of those that are pro-Israel and those are against Israel. So it's quite amazing that now theologies are lining up and the hope and the call for Messiah. And up until this point, only about 10% of the Jewish population ever even talked about a Messiah. This was only in the Haredi and in the very Orthodox communities was there any messianic prophecy or any messianic hope, even though all of Judaism today would be classified as Pharisaical. I don't know of any Sadducees that just believe in the law, don't read the prophets, don't believe in the writings, don't believe in the Psalms. I don't know any. There might be sects out there of Sadduceical teachers, but predominantly we all, Jew and Gentile believers, all fall into the Pharisaical category of believing in the law, the prophets, and the writings, which was, I think we've taken the word Pharisee and made it an insult.
Right.
When it's simply a theology.
And it was a division between the Pharisees and the Sadducees that even got violent at times back in the days of Jesus and just before his birth. But I think and I'm glad you brought this point back to Jewish theology, because again, as we look at what they teach, what they believe, what they're looking for, prophetically speaking, I think the enemy is setting up a deception that will lure many into welcoming the wrong man, and I use that word deliberately, as the Messiah. Just as they were looking for the wrong kind of Messiah when Jesus arrived, I think they'll be looking for a geopolitical savior in these days, and there will be one who comes along. And I think this is what we see at the end of Daniel chapter 11, beginning at verse 40. Those last 5 verses in Daniel read like the wars of Antichrist. And I have to give credit where it's due. A brilliant young man named Chris White, in a book called False Christ, which is just, Antichrist, put forward this scenario, and I think he's right on the money. Daniel 11, beginning at verse 40, reads, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. And I believe the him there, that pronoun, refers to the Antichrist, a separate character from the next character introduced in the verse here. But the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind. So I think you're looking at 3 characters there, the king of the south, the king of the north, and him being the Antichrist. But this him, this Antichrist figure, will win a spectacular victory over the near enemies of Israel. This could be describing a Psalm 83 type scenario. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and with many ships. And he, this would be the Antichrist, shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land. And so he basically is a victor. I won't read the whole section here for time constraints, but he winds up winning a victory against Israel. In so doing, and of course the nearby neighbors of Israel are all majority Muslim, and I think it's fair to say, it's a safe bet, that a geopolitical, a military figure who leads Israel to a victory that perhaps results in expanding Israel's borders, as you described in the first segment, to fulfill the Genesis 15 promise to Abraham, would be considered a Messiah, an anointed one by the Orthodox and Haredi rabbis. But here's the thing, the last verse of Daniel 11 prophesies that this Antichrist figure, and he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, as of course Zion, Jerusalem, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. Now, when we look at the book of Revelation, we know that the beast, the Antichrist, is one of the heads on this beast, one of the 8 heads, has what appears to be a mortal wound, but then he's restored, revived, resuscitated, brought back from the dead. What an apparent miracle. And people are, well, he must be supernatural. This must be the Messiah. Well, here we see it in Daniel 11. A geopolitical savior, a military savior of Israel, comes to his end with none to help him. But this fits into the eschatological teachings of the rabbis, looking for a Messiah ben Joseph who falls in the war against Gog of Magog, and then is either brought back to life as Messiah ben David, or is restored to life by Messiah ben David, who then goes on to win the war, cleanse the holy city, and pass judgment on the nations. So I think this figure described as he, the Antichrist figure in Daniel 11, 40 through 45, fits the profile of what we Christians call the Antichrist. But sadly, I think Jews who are looking for Messiah will see him as their Savior and see him as Messiah and welcome him with open arms until such time as, according to Daniel 9, halfway through the 7 weeks, the 7 years, that final week rather, the 7-year period, he sets himself up in the temple and causes the abomination that causes desolation, declares himself to be a god.
You know, what's so interesting is that whenever there's an authentic, there's going to be a counterfeit.
Yes.
And when he talks about single-handedly, this is the parallel to Isaiah 63:3 or 63:2. It says, "Why are your clothes red and your garments like one who treads the winepress? I have trodden the winepress alone, and no one from the nations was with me. I trampled them in my anger and trod them underfoot in my fury. Their blood spattered my garments, and all my clothes were stained. For the day of vengeance was in my heart, and the year of my redemption had come." This is the salvation of Israel at the single hand of Messiah, who defeats the armies of the Antichrist by himself. So you have this wording which is so similar, and it parallels the authentic and the counterfeit, that it's just stunning, the way that God continues to allow us to boldly see both sides of this coin, and we must choose heads or tails. We had to choose heads or tails in the garden. We had to choose heads or tails when we came to Messiah. And when we come face to face with the Antichrist, we're going to have to choose heads or tails. Again, we are going to have to make a decision between the authentic and the counterfeit. It takes me back to the rabbis who espoused that the Messiah was going to raise the dead, and he was going to heal the lepers, and he was going to do all these wonderful things. And John the Baptist sends the message, "Are you the one to come, or is one going to come after you?" And Jesus answers him, and he says, "Go back and report to John what you've seen and heard. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and good news is preached to the pure." Answering every one of their points of expectation, saying, when the Messiah comes, these are the things he's going to do, and he enumerates them, and they still don't believe. And he even says to them, when they say, "Show us a miracle," he said, "All this has been done in front of you, and you still don't believe."
Right.
And so here we are 2,000 years later, and we're still seeing miraculous healings. Okay? If you run the circles that I run in, I'm a person that was 70% deaf. I have Meniere's disease. I listen unaided. I haven't had hearing aids for 20 years. When someone laid hands on my ears, and my hearing was restored. So I believe in that. I'm the Pentecostal, charismatic, spirit-filled Jew that believes in all that. But you and I both agree that there is a deception coming. And this is the time for you and I and the rest of the body of Messiah to sharpen our faith, to take a position where we study and we understand these prophecies, because if we do not, we stand the chance of winding up on the wrong side of this equation. Derek Gilbert, unfortunately, we've run out of time. It is always a delight to be with you. We never have enough time. Just so many things for us to talk about, but you are a dear friend, a respected brother, and a tremendous author and researcher, and I can't wait for the next book to come out. But in the meantime, as you prepare for his new book to come out, read The Last Clash of the Titans, be blown away, read all of Derek Gilbert's work. You can find all of his interviews on our YouTube channel, or you can follow him at Skywatch TV, or any number of places. Just put in the name Derek Gilbert, and you're going to see a plethora of resources. Plus, he's here on the second Monday of every month at the 11 o'clock hour. Derek Gilbert, thank you. Our love and blessings to your bride and to all of our friends there at Skywatch TV.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's my pleasure, my honor.
God bless you. Thank you. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we will bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.